بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our second session on the four Gospels in the New Testament, a class for Muslims, introduction to the four Gospels. Last time we talked about some of the theological trends that we see in the Old and New Testaments. We had mentioned a few things about Isa alayhi salam and how he confirms the theology of the Old Testament. This is something that's a recurring theme in the Quran. وَصَدِّقَ لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيَ مِنَ التَّوْرَةِ. We find this in the Quran many times, that Isa alayhi salam is quoted as saying, I have come to confirm the theology of the Torah. And time and again in the New Testament, Isa alayhi salam, he will quote from the Old Testament. He will quote from the Torah in order to teach the Bani Israel their theology, a reminder of their theology. So we talked about Exodus chapter 20, which is the beginning of the Ten Commandments. And there are two versions of the Ten Commandments in the Torah. There's one in Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20. Exodus 20 appears to be the older text. If you're familiar with higher criticism of the Old Testament, Julius Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis, that there are four different sources basically of the Torah. We won't get into that much in detail. Again, this class is more focused on the Gospels. But basically, to make a long story short, the text of Exodus seems to be older than the text of Deuteronomy. And it's very, very clear the first three commandments are dealing explicitly with theology. Thou shalt not make unto thyself the image or the likeness of anything in the heavens or in the earth or in the oceans, right? Laysa kamithlihi shay'un. We see this theme again in the book of Deutero-Isaiah, right? Which is, the middle portion of the book of Isaiah, this proto-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah. Deutero-Isaiah basically states that God is completely transcendent of his creation in any material or temporal or spatial sense. He transcends space-time and materiality, and this is true theology as we would see it as Muslims. So the definition of idolatry, according to Deutero-Isaiah and Exodus 20, this is Old Testament or Jewish theology, the very definition of idolatry is when we bring God down into his material creation, right? Is when we say that this stick or this statue or this animal or this human being, whatever that thing is, if we believe that's God, then this is a very definition of idolatry, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is by his very nature transcendent of space-time and materiality. That doesn't mean that he's not close to us in a relational sense. Of course he is. He is transcendent in a physical sense, but also close to us in a metaphysical sense, in a relational sense, in the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves us and he cares for us. And this is evident in the Quran. Inni qareeb. وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيب. When my servants ask you concerning me, say, indeed, I am close to them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a personal deity. Again, if you listen to rhetoric, or if you listen to Christian fundamentalist polemicists, you'll hear a lot of things like the God that Muslims worship is not a personal deity. He's far removed, he's remote, he's unapproachable, things like that. That's not true at all. Inni qareeb, Allah is close to us. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبًّا لِلَّهِ. Those who believe are overflowing in their love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Wadud, he is the all-loving. This is a name, one of the great attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. This whole idea of God having sons, we reject physically, but that doesn't mean that the meaning, the ma'na, isn't there, right? And this is indicated in hadith, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he saw that woman running around looking for her son that was lost, and then she picked up her son, and she hugged him and squeezed him and kissed him, and he said to the Sahaba, can you imagine this woman throwing her son into a fire? And they said, La wallahi. He said, Allahu arhamu bi ibadihi min hadhihi bi waladiha. Allah is more merciful to his servants than this woman is to her son. So he's using that filial, parental analogy when describing the love of God. Is it literally like that? No, it's not literally like that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not our literal father. We're not his literal children, right? We're not the abna'ullah, right? as you know, when this verse Ayatul Imtihan, according to the Mufassirin, was revealed, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهِ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهِ. Say, if you love Allah, you have to follow me. Then Allah will love you. Why was this verse revealed? According to some of the exegetes, like Ibn Abbas, he says because Bani Israel, the Jews said, نَحْنُ أَبْنَاءُ اللَّهِ, we are the sons of God. And they didn't even mean that in a literal sense. They meant that in the sense that Allah loves us so much, we don't even have to believe in your message, right? And that's a form of kufr. So even if you love Allah in the true sense, in the correct sense, if you reject His messengers, then this is not true love. This love will not be reciprocated from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we want to be loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's why the ulama say it's much more important for you to be loved by Allah than for you to love Allah. Right? Because that's what counts at the end of the day. Does Allah love you? And one of the ways that we can tell, or indications that Allah loves us, is when we meet the ulama, when they look at us, how do they feel when they look at us? Do they have love for us? That's a good indication that Allah loves you as well. And an indication that you love Allah is, if when you look at the ulama, what comes into your heart? Do you feel jealousy? Do you feel hatred? Are you disgusted by them? Or is there love? Do you want to adhere to what they're saying? If that's true, the latter is true, then it's an indication that you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, this was a problem early on. Thomas Aquinas, because he's a Neoplatonist. Again, we talked about Thomas Aquinas last time. Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica, one of the most comprehensive expositions of Orthodox Christianity, or at least Catholic Orthodoxy, dealing with virtue ethics, the nature of God, the nature of Isa alayhi salam, the nature of Jesus Christ. And he's thoroughly Neoplatonist in his orientation. So Thomas Aquinas is known as being the great synthesizer of Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity and Neoplatonism, which is from the ancient Greeks, obviously. So he's trying to work with this idea of Aristotle, who said that it's impossible for God to love human beings and vice versa. Why did Aristotle say that? Aristotle said because human beings and God are not the same genus, they're not the same species. So it's really impossible for God to love you and for you to love God. So Aristotle's God is a God that is totally transcendent, a God removed, right? The deistic God, right? Like the God of the founding fathers of America. Probably the first 6 presidents were deists. They're not Christian, right? Which means that they did not believe that Isa alayhi salam is even a prophet. They didn't believe in the Bible at all. Thomas Jefferson, for example, did not believe that God has any interaction with humanity, that He simply created us and then He leaves us to our own devices. This is deism, right? And it's really from the post-Enlightenment period that has its origins in Neoplatonism, which has its origins in these ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. So Aristotle very clearly says it's impossible for God to love you. There's too big of a gap. You're not the same species. So he would also argue, for example, you don't truly love your pet, your cat or your dog, because you're not the same genus. So what Aquinas does, and again, Aquinas' theology and philosophy is still the standard in the Roman Catholic Church. He integrates the two. He tries to find a medium position or a solution for this dilemma. And he says, yes, that's true. God and man are not of the same genus. How do we bridge this gap? Is that God becomes a man, right? So he asks a question in his Summa Theologica. He says, Cur Deus homo, why did God become a human being? Because He wants to demonstrate love to us, right? But the problem with this idea is that when we bring God physically into His creation, again, this is the very definition of idolatry as espoused by the Old Testament. So this is not a solution. This is unnecessary. God does not dwell within His creation, because then He becomes dependent on things, right? And this is, the Roman Catholic Church, they accuse the Jews of deicide, of killing God, because Catholics believe, Christians in general believe, that God came down to earth in the form of a man. It's very, very... So the answer, Islamically, Imam Ghazali, for example, who is one of the influences of Thomas Aquinas' virtue theory, not necessarily his theology, but his virtue theory. Imam Ghazali would say that God demonstrates his love to us by sending messengers, not becoming a messenger or becoming a human being, because subhanahu, he is above such things. He transcends space-time and materiality. The greatest demonstration of God's love towards humanity is the sending of messengers. And the greatest messenger is the Prophet ﷺ. This is why he's called Rahmatan lil Alameen, right? This is truly how to bridge the gap. And this stays in line with the theology that was given to Musa alayhi salam and given to Harun alayhi salam and Ilyas alayhi salam and Yunus, these great prophets of Bani Israel. This was their theology. Laysa kamithlihi shay'un. The book of Hosea in the Old Testament, chapter 11, verse 19, says very clearly in the Hebrew language, Ki anochi el velo ish. Verily I am God and not a man. Right? It's very clear. And this is mentioned a few times in the book of Numbers also. Right? Lo ish el. God is not a man. What does that mean? That God and man are mutually exclusive. That's what it means. God and man are mutually exclusive in Jewish theology and in what we would consider to be true, original Christian, if you want to say Christian, or the theology of Isa alayhi salam and the Hawariyun. This does not mean, again, that we can't have a personal relationship with God, we can't love God. No. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَّدُّ حُبًّا لِلَّهِ. We love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why do we love Him? Because we recognize His blessings, His ni'am. And the greatest manifestation of the ni'am of Allah is the sending of al-anbiya. And the greatest anbiya is the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This is why he's rahmatil lil alameen. So this verse 21:107, verse 21:107, Surah Al-Anbiya, ayah 107, this is our equivalent of John 3:16. So I'm sure many Muslims, when you watch like a football game, a basketball game, somebody in the crowd will pull out a poster that says John 3:16, or if you go to a restaurant, In-N-Out Burger or Forever 19, you look on the tags on the bottom of the cup sometimes, it says John 3:16. What is John 3:16? We'll talk about that when we get to the Gospel of John. Very interesting gospel, by the way. By far my favorite gospel, the Gospel of John. But John 3:16 is one verse in the New Testament, which is sort of the summation of how Christians feel or what they believe about Isa alayhi salam, right? If you were to take Christian theology and break it down to its essence, its core, or in a nutshell, right? You would quote John 3:16. I would say Surah Al-Anbiya, ayah number 107. That's our equivalent of John 3:16. That if you were to take the Prophet ﷺ and you had one statement you can say that captures the essence most fully about who he was, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. This is the verse that all of us should have memorized. So, talking about the Gospel of Mark, one more thing we'll mention here, and this is also found in Mark, and this is very, very important for Muslims to make a note of. Mark chapter 10, verse 18. And Western secularist historians like Dale Martin at Yale, they have certain methods of historiography that they use to analyze the New Testament. And one of these methods is called, criterion is called dissimilarity. In other words, if something is in the New Testament that sort of cuts against the grain of what early Hellenistic Christians would have wanted to have said about Jesus, then that's probably true, because it's embarrassing for them, right? To give an example, in Mark 10:18, a scribe comes to Jesus and he says, "Good master," right? Didaskale agathe, good master, what must I do to gain eternal life? Right? Jesus responds by saying, according to the Greek, he says, "Ti me leges agathan, udes agathan emehes hatheas." He says, why me are you calling good? No one is good but one, that is God. Right? This is very embarrassing for Hellenistic Trinitarian Christians. So Dale Martin, according to his historiography, he says that this verse is probably authentic then, because it cuts against the grain of what early Christians would have wanted to have said about Jesus. Right? Very interesting. But an interesting sentence structure here in the Greek. Some translations say, it says, why are you calling me good, right? But the Greek actually says ti me leges, so it brings the maf'ul, which is the direct object, forward, and essentially is saying, why me do you call good, right? So it's almost as if Isa alayhi salam is offended by the question, is offended by being called good, and this is from his tawadu', this is from his humility. There's no one good but one, and that is God. He's teaching them, this type of really rigid, strict tawheed, this monotheism, but still that relational aspect, that love of God, of course, is there as well. So Orthodox Trinitarian Christology, as we know it today, did not really start to take shape until after 381 of the Common Era. That's when Athanasius, he was representing the Orthodox position, proto-Orthodox position at Council of Nicaea. We'll talk more about these councils. That was after the De Trinitate of Augustine of Hippo, the Cappadocian Church Fathers, as well, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk more about that. Now we're going to get into the actual first gospel in the New Testament. Now you might say the first gospel, according to my New Testament, is the Gospel of Matthew, right? That's the first book of the New Testament. However, by consensus, the first gospel out of these four to be written was not Matthew, it was Mark. Mark was the first one to be written out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So why is Matthew at the beginning of the New Testament? Scholars say it's because Matthew provides a more fluid transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, right? Because Matthew is the most, quote, Jewish gospel. Isa alayhi salam in the Gospel of Matthew quotes most extensively from the Old Testament. Matthew alludes to the Old Testament over 100 times in his gospel, the gospel according to Matthew. So it makes a more smoother transition, right? But if we're going to study chronologically, then we would study first the Gospel of Mark. This was the first of the four Gospels. Of course, there are many other Gospels that did not make it into the New Testament, right? And we'll talk about that as well. There's a Gospel according to Peter, right? There's a Gospel according to Mary Magdalene. There's a Gospel according to Philip. There's a Gospel according to Judas. There's a Gospel according to Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator, right? It's very interesting why these books were rejected by the bishops at certain church synods and councils. Why were these rejected and these four books accepted, right? So, the Gospel of Mark, who is Mark? Mark is called John Mark. He was a student of Peter, according to Christian tradition, right? Mark was a student of Peter. But we have a gospel according to Peter. Why is this book not in the New Testament? Because Christian scholars say, that book is spurious. It's apocryphal, right? It's heresy, right? But he's the teacher of Mark. So there's an inconsistency here. You're taking the book of a tabi'i, a follower, but not the book of the sahabi, Peter, right? So the reality of the situation is this, that Mark did not in fact write Mark, nor did Peter write Peter. No real scholar believes that. You might get some really fundamentalist type Christians that'll believe that. The vast majority of Christian scholars do not believe that Matthew wrote Matthew, that Mark wrote Mark, Luke, John. No one really believes that. Again, these books are anonymous. So when we look at the Gospel of Mark, for example, Mark does not identify himself, right? He doesn't say, for example, this is the Gospel of me, Mark, I'm a student of Peter. There's no such identification, self-identification. This book is totally anonymous. Then how did they come up with the word Mark? How did they come up with this title? You see, there was a Christian bishop who lived at the very beginning of the 3rd century, the end of the 2nd century. His name was Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, the patristic leaders of the church. And he was the actual one that named these four books. He named them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And why did he name them these four books? Why did he pick these four names? Because at that time, there were so many Gospels floating around that were attributed to companions of Isa alayhi salam, disciples of Isa alayhi salam, And he liked these 4 books. So in order to bolster their credibility, right, he ascribed them to 2 disciples of Isa alayhi salam and 2 pupils of 2 disciples. In order to do what? In order to bolster their credibility. So these books are basically what's known as pseudonymous. Pseudonymous. So they're anonymous, which means they're not identifying themselves, but above and beyond that, they're pseudonymous, which means they were falsely ascribed to different people, to people that did not write them. This is called pseudonymity. This was quite common in the ancient world, but it was not an accepted practice. Some Christians will say, oh, that's just the way the world was, and it was an accepted practice. It was not an accepted practice. It was seen as forgery. It was seen as deception, right? So these 4 books are really, essentially, forgeries. And if you want a really good book that talks more about this, I recommend Dr. Bart Ehrman, E-H-R-M-A-N, who is very famous. He wrote, Misquoting Jesus, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, Truth and Fiction in the Da Vinci Code. He has another book called Forged, where he actually goes into these issues, the implications of people writing in the name of God, not just in the name of an apostle or a prophet, but in the name of God. What are the implications of that? So even though this was common in the Greco-Roman world, pseudonymity, it was always looked down upon, because the main reason for doing something like that was to deceive people. Now, why do you want to deceive people? There's a number of reasons. Maybe you want to make a lot of money. This certainly is very plausible today. You have people that forge a lot of things and forge autographs, for example, take it to the pawn shop and say this is an autograph of whoever, the president or something like that, and try to make a lot of money. But back then, there's really no money to be made. Why would people forge things back then? It's because they wanted their own ideological positions to take the upper hand, because there's always a political aspect to things, and politics is a very corrupting factor, as we know. So in the ancient world, for example, if somebody was a student of Aristotle and they were brilliant and they wanted their opinions to get out there to make a difference in the world, they might write something and say, this is by Aristotle, and sign Aristotle, and that's a form of forgery. Now, in his mind, he might be totally justified and say, well, my intentions are good, I have good things to say to people, but still that's a form of forgery, right? And that's something that was condemned in the ancient world. What's really interesting is, if you read the book of 2 Thessalonians in the New Testament, this is a book that apparently was written by Paul. The person who wrote this epistle identifies himself as Paul. And in this epistle, the author, Paul, he condemns a letter or another letter that is being circulated around the churches that is a false letter, a forgery, right? So this was very common even in the first century. Someone in the first century is writing pretending to be Paul. The irony of all of this is that most scholars actually believe the author of the book of 2 Thessalonians is not Paul. It's someone pretending to be Paul. So in other words, someone pretending to be Paul is condemning someone who's pretending to be Paul. And the reason that a person would do that is to sort of cover his own track, right? Condemning something that he's already doing. So this is very, very interesting. So Mark did not write the gospel according to Mark. This is by consensus of New Testament scholarship. The only people that really believe that, again, are people that study at like Jerry Falwell's University, Liberty University, or the Moody Bible Institute. These people believe in a literal, fundamentalist type of interpretation of the Bible. The vast majority of Christian scholars do not believe. Irenaeus of Lyon, who died 202 of the Common Era, he was the one who attributed apostolic authorities to these 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the reason why he did that is to bolster their credibility amongst all in the face or vis-a-vis all of these opposing writings that claim to have apostolic authorities as well. But traditionally, Christians do believe that Mark is a student of Peter. And who is Peter? The Catholic Christians, Roman Catholics, believe that Peter was the first pope, the first pontiff, right? And that he's buried in Rome, that he died in Rome, and the actual site of the Vatican is built upon his grave. And they use a verse that's found in the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For example, in Mark chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus says to Peter, "Su e Petros, you are Peter." So the word Peter is not his actual name. It comes from the Greek Petros. And Petros means a stone, like Petra, right? A stone or a rock. This is the nickname that Isa alayhi salam gave to him according to the New Testament. His actual name was Shimon Bar Yona, Simon, the son of Jonah. But he was surnamed Peter or Petros in Greek, or Sepha in Hebrew, by Isa alayhi salam. Now, there's also, with regards to the author of the Gospel of Mark, there's an incident, very interesting incident that happens at the end of the Gospel, or towards the end of the Gospel. In Mark chapter 14, when Isa alayhi salam is on the Mount of Olives and he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and according to Mark, some of the temple guard from the temple in Jerusalem, they come to arrest him, and there's a youth, and the word in Greek is Nianiskas, and Nianiskas, a young man is there, and he is seized by the temple guard, but he manages to kind of slip out of his garments, and he runs away gumnas, he runs away naked. Right? This youth who's there, he runs away naked. According to many scholars, this is actually Mark, right? That is on the Mount of Olives with Isa alayhi salam and slips away from them. Many other scholars believe that this person is a fictional person that Mark invented for the purposes of getting a theological message across that we have to be as innocent as children. We have to follow Jesus as innocent as children, and it may require us to strip off the clothes of the dunya. And if you notice at the end of the Gospel of Mark, when Mary Magdalene and the other women, they look inside the tomb, they see this young man sitting in the tomb, and it's probably the same young man. Again, the message here is not that this was literally what happened, but that we need to consider ourselves to be people of the grave while we're still living. Wallahu alam. When was the Gospel written? By consensus, it was written around 67 to 70 of the Common Era. 67 to 70 of the Common Era. And this date is significant, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Where was it written? It was written in Rome. That's the dominant opinion. So again, Rome is where Peter and Paul died and were buried traditionally. Historians, in reality, have no idea really where these men were buried, or even if they lived, especially Peter. But traditionally, it's in Rome, and that's where the Gospel was written by the dominant opinion of New Testament scholars. For whom was the Gospel written? Hellenistic Christians living around the Mediterranean. Hellenistic Christians living around. So basically, the Christian congregations that were founded by Paul in his missionary activity. Paul and his adherents, like Timothy and Titus and Barnabas and the rest of them. Right? So these are churches that Paul founded in Ephesus and Rome and Athens, in Corinth, in other places, Colossia, Thessalonica. Right. So then the historical background here is very, very important to understand the Gospel of Mark. This is very much a wartime gospel. Okay, 67 to 70 of the Common Era was the time of the Jewish War. So there was a Jewish philosopher and historian named Flavius Josephus, who actually has a book called The Jewish War, in which he documents what happened during this time. Of course, this was the time when a group of zealot Jews were holed up in the temple precincts, and the Emperor Vespasian sent his son, General Titus, to crush the rebellion. These Jews refused to come out of the temple. They had sought sanctuary. Titus told them to leave. They did not, so he completely destroyed. He burned the temple to the ground. The only remaining part of the temple that stands to this day is called HaKotel, or the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, where we've seen pictures where Jews go and they will pray standing in front of this wall. So this was happening at the time of the composition of Mark's Gospel, the Jewish War, which is obviously a time of turmoil happening in Palestine. The temple was destroyed at this time for the second time. It was destroyed in 586 before the Common Era, the first time, by the Babylonians under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And it happened on the 9th of Av. This is the Hebrew calendar. The 9th of Av, the 9th of the month of Av in 586 before the Common Era. The temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And now in 70 of the Common Era, again on the 9th of Av, the temple is destroyed by the Romans under General Titus. So this 9th of Av is a day of fasting for Jews. There's 4 major fasting days for Jews. Of course, Yom Kippur and the 9th of Av is also included amongst the major fasting days. And this, again, is the beginning of what's known as rabbinical Judaism, right? The temple is destroyed. The rabbis, they start this council at Gemenia. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Hillel are the founders. Rabbi Judah Hanasi, Judah the prince. What do we do now? So they decided we need to write down the oral law we talked about. The oral law needs to be written down. It became the first part of the Talmud, and then rabbis would comment upon the Talmud, the first part of the Talmud, which is called the Mishnah, and the commentaries are called the Gemara. Together, the Mishnah and the Gemara, these make up the Talmud, right? So this is the beginnings of rabbinical Judaism, or post-Second Temple Judaism. Of course, also at this point, the Roman emperor, he was the 5th Roman emperor, was named Nero. And Nero did not like Christians at all. In fact, he persecuted Christians. His reign ended around 68 of the Common Era, again, contemporary with the composition of the Gospel of Mark. Nero actually, according to the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, he actually burnt down, set ablaze a great part of the city of Rome. And the reason he did that is because he wanted to construct new architecture for himself. So he burnt down intentionally a major part of the city, and then he blamed it on the Christians of the city of Rome. So this is known as a false flag operation, right, where the government will do something and blame a minority within his country. So then it takes the focus off of him. And this happened, the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin, for example, to get America into the war, and other instances as well that we won't go into right now, but very common type of thing to do, governments in power, false flag operation. So this is what Nero did. He set a major part of the city of Rome on fire, and then he blamed the Christians. And Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus, they mentioned some of the horrific ways in which Nero would torture and execute the Christians living in the city. Also during this time, you have natural disasters, earthquakes at Pompeii, Naples, the Eastern Mediterranean. In 79, you have Mount Vesuvius, right, exploding. So these were seen by early Christians as portents of the end of time, right? Christians believed at the time of the Gospel of Mark's composition that all of these things meant that the end of time, what's known as the eschaton, right, in Greek, the eschaton, was imminent. It was about to happen, right? Isa alayhi salam had come. He was rejected. He was crucified according to Christians. He was resurrected. He promises to come again in the future, right? Then you have these natural disasters. You have Nero persecuting Christians. You have the temple being completely destroyed, right? So these were seen as major portents of the end of time. So you have to remember this. Mark is writing in this context. Mark believes, very much like Paul believed, that the end of time was in his lifetime. This is very, very apparent when you read the Pauline epistles. If you read the 14 epistles that are attributed to Paul, Paul actually only wrote 7 of them genuinely. The other 7 are forgeries in the name of Paul. But the central Pauline theme is that the end of time is going to happen very soon in his own lifetime. So Paul's advice on marriage, celibacy, divorce, slavery, all of that is predicated upon his belief in an immediate parousia, an immediate second coming of Isa alayhi salam. That's what he believed, and it didn't happen, right? Paul says we're going to be transformed in the twinkling of an eye, caught up in the clouds with the Lord. The very frame of the world is passing away. He tells people, don't even worry about getting married. You're not going to have enough time to enjoy yourself. Don't even count on using your goods that you just bought in the marketplace, right? It's going to happen very, very quickly. Not in the sense of, relatively speaking, like the Prophet ﷺ said, Ana was kahatain, that I and the hour are like this. Relatively speaking, right? Because human beings have been on the earth for tens of thousands of years. But that's not how Paul is speaking here. Paul is saying in his own lifetime, the end of time will happen. And this is verifiably false, right? Paul made a major error here. So we can rule out Paul as being a true prophet, even by the standards of the Old Testament. The book of Deuteronomy says, if a would-be prophet says something will come to pass and it does not, then he is a false prophet. It's very simple. And it's very interesting, we talked about the book of 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians, which is not written by Paul, but written in the name of Paul, will actually try to delay the end of time, to sort of save Paul some face. Very, very interesting, but that's outside the scope of this class. So anyway, the bottom line here is that the Markan Jesus, right, the Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, we'll call him the Markan Jesus, he also believes that the end of time is going to happen during his lifetime. He says in Mark chapter 9, he says, for example, there are some standing here that will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in great power, right? So an immediate second coming. There are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man, referring to himself, the second coming. He says the present generation will live to see it all. So these words were put into the mouth of the Markan Jesus by Pauline elements. All four Gospels have been influenced by Paul. Paul was the first one to write anything down that was later to be considered scripture of the Christians, right? Paul is writing around 45-50 of the Common Era. The Gospel of Mark is written 67 to 70 of the Common Era, to those same congregations that were founded by Paul in those congregations around the Mediterranean. So that has to be made clear. Now, there's two periods that Mark is talking about. Right? You can divide the Gospel of Mark into two distinct periods. The Galilean period, right, of Isa alayhi salam. So the ministry of Isa alayhi salam, according to Mark, is only about 1 year. So he starts when he's 30. By 31, he's already been ascended, right, according to the Gospel of Mark. The vast majority of his ministry, almost the entire year, he's in Galilee. Galilee is in northern Palestine, the province of Galilee. He's in a city called Nazareth. This is called the Galilean ministry. So this is basically the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. Chapters 1 through 8 is Jesus' Galilean ministry. And the Gospel of Mark begins with Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. There is no nativity narrative. There's no Molid mentioned of Isa alayhi salam. There's no virgin birth mentioned by the Gospel of Mark. There's no virgin birth. It begins with the baptism of Isa alayhi salam. There's no nativity narrative in the Gospel of Mark. Okay, the nativity narrative comes later in the Gospel of Matthew and in Luke. Mark begins at the baptism. The second half of the Gospel of Mark is the Judean ministry. This is Isa alayhi salam when he goes to the province of Judea, the city of Jerusalem, and he's only there for about a week. So basically 51 weeks he's in Galilee, and 1 week he's in Jerusalem, according to the Gospel of Mark. He enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, right? He manages to seize the temple, right? Which again, this is something that is it sort of cuts against the grain of what early Christians would have wanted to have said about Jesus. The early Christians want to say about Jesus that he's God, he's the Son of God, Hellenistic Christians that is, and that he is the Prince of Peace, he turns the other cheek. But now you have this incident of Jesus seizing the temple, right? And this is mentioned in all 4 Gospels, actually twice in the Gospel of John. How does someone seize the temple if not through military means? This is, the week of Passover. There's tens of thousands of Jews in the temple precincts. The Roman centurions everywhere. How does Isa alayhi salam seize the temple if people aren't armed? This is somewhat embarrassing for Christians to talk about, because that's the only logical sort of explanation for what happened. The Gospels say that Isa alayhi salam, he simply went and rode a donkey into Jerusalem. He took a small whip and started turning over tables. But that's not how you seize an entire temple. It must have been done through military means, at least according to Dale Martin, who's a Christian historian at Yale University. So this is kind of an embarrassing sort of thing for Christians, but if you think about it, that's probably what happened. Allahu alam. Anyway, so he enters the city of Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He seizes the temple. So for that entire week, he's teaching in the temple, right? At that time, they don't just let any rabbi into the temple. If he's teaching in the temple, that means he has authority. He has indeed seized the temple through militaristic means. Allahu alam. However, by Good Friday, he's already dead, right? So he enters the city of Jerusalem on Sunday. He preaches throughout the week. On Friday, which is called Good Friday, by 3 p.m., according to the Gospel of Mark, he dies on the cross. And then 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, he's resurrected, according to the Gospel of Mark. And then he ascends a short time later, although the ascension is not mentioned by Mark. The ending of Mark is very interesting, and we'll talk about that as well. So basically, again, these are the two periods of the Gospel of Mark. You have the Galilean ministry, then you have the Judean ministry. Now we have major themes of the Gospel of Mark. One of the major themes, as we mentioned earlier, is that Mark believes in an imminent eschaton. Right? That the end of time is going to happen during his lifetime, during the lifetime of Isa alayhi salam. This is a central theme in the Gospel of Mark, in imminent eschatology. Eschatology means the study of the last things, right? So like ahadith of akhir zaman. We have a very large literature in our tradition of end of time literature, right? We would say these are eschatological hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The central theme of the Gospel of Mark is an immediate end of time. That's why Mark uses the adverb euthos time and time again, dozens of times in the Gospel of Mark. Mark uses the Greek euthos, which means immediately, suddenly, because he wants to give you that impression that this thing is coming to an end. It's going to be over. Isa alayhi salam is going to return any time now, and it's going to be the end of the world. Also, another theme of the Gospel of Mark is that you have somewhat of this, in our tradition we would say like a nasibi, sort of hatred of the family of Isa alayhi salam, or at least this sort of slighting of the family of Isa alayhi salam. And this is apparent in the Gospel of Mark chapter 3 verse 35, when a group of disciples come to Isa alayhi salam and they say, your mother and your brother are waiting outside. And he says, who are my mother and my brother? Whoever does the will of God are my mother, my brother, and my sisters. And this is seen as sort of Isa alayhi salam, according to Mark, slighting his family, which is very, very interesting, because remember, the Khalifa, if you will, of Isa alayhi salam after his ascension was his brother James, right? His brother James was the successor of Isa alayhi salam. But James has no real role in any gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, you don't come across James at all, really. And it's very, very strange that you don't hear about him. And it's not until the book of Acts where James has a very central role that he is the actual successor of Isa alayhi salam. And don't forget as well, as we mentioned in the last class, that Paul's enemy, if you will, is in fact James. There is this very clear Pauline, Jamesonian tension that happens in the New Testament, that these two men are teaching fundamentally different things, right? And that's going to be made more clear when we study the Pauline corpus of literature. You also have this sort of, I guess we would say in our tradition, kind of Rafidis, kind of this hatred of the disciples of Isa alayhi salam in the Gospel of Mark as well. Not only of his family, but of the disciples in general. The disciples in the Gospel of Mark are truly inept people, right? They just don't understand anything. They're always making mistakes in judgment. Jesus is always lecturing them. I mean, it's a really sad situation that the disciples of Isa alayhi salam are really kind of just insulted, looked down upon, people who just simply don't get it. And this might be an indication of Mark's sort of anti-Jewish, anti-Jamesonian sort of orientation or stance he's taken, favoring Paul's position on certain things as well. So the Gospel of Mark is somewhat anti-Jewish in that sense, is that the disciples, because they're Jews, they just don't get Isa alayhi salam at all. So this idea also of supersessionism, that Judaism has effectively been replaced by Christianity, that Judaism really doesn't have any type of reality anymore. Early Christian fathers like Justin Martyr and Origen of Alexandria, they actually believed that the temple, the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era was a direct result of the Jews' disbelief in Isa alayhi salam. Very, very interesting. Another major theme, so you have eschatology, you have anti-Jewishness. Another theme is, it's very secretive. The Gospel of Mark, if you read the Gospel of Mark, you'll find when Isa alayhi salam is extracting demons, for example, he tells those demons, when they bow down to him and say, "You are the Son of the Blessed, you are the Son of David," and Jesus is always saying to them, "Be quiet, don't tell anyone." He commands them not to tell anybody. This is called the Messianic secret, and it's found only in the Gospel of Mark. Why is it such a secret? This phrase, Messianic secret, was coined by the German scholar William Reed, and there's many theories as to why Jesus is keeping these things a secret while he's in Galilee. One prominent theory is that the Galileans, of course, the Jews in northern Palestine, they were known for two things. They were known for fishing, and they were known for zealotry or insurrectionism against the Roman occupiers. So if Jesus comes out and says, for example, "Yes, I am the Messiah," again, that has political ramifications. It's not just him being a mystic, sort of itinerant teacher. If you say that you're the Messiah, what you're saying basically is, you're the king of Israel, in fact, the king of the world, eventually. So this is something that would get him killed very quickly. So this is one of the theories of New Testament scholars as to why Isa alayhi salam is always commanding people not to divulge that he is the actual Messiah. Of course, when Jesus was young and living in Nazareth, he probably remembers what had happened to Judas the Galilean, one of the Messianic claimants, who in 6 of the Common Era was crucified by the Romans, and a bunch of his men as well, for making Messianic claims and for general insurrectionism against the Roman Empire. Another reason scholars have surmised that explains the Messianic secret is because maybe there just wasn't a lot of Christians at the time of the Gospel of Mark, and so Mark, kind of embarrassed as to why this movement is so fledgling and it's not growing, he has Jesus command people not to divulge his true identity. Allahu Alam. But this is definitely a major theme in the New Testament, in specifically in the Gospel of Mark, exclusively in the Gospel of Mark. So you have eschatology, you have anti-Jewishness, you have the Messianic secret. Another theme is the cross, right? The death of Isa alayhi salam, again, according to the Gospel of Mark. In fact, the entire Gospel of Mark is basically an extended passion narrative of Isa alayhi salam. So this is the whole point of the Gospel of Mark, is the death of Isa alayhi salam, that he has to die, right? It's an extended passion, the passion narrative. What does passion narrative mean? It means basically the final week, or the final weekend, or the final few days of the life of Isa alayhi salam. So remember, when we look at the Gospel of Mark, you have 8 chapters about 51 or so weeks, and then another 8 chapters about 1 week. So this is the focus of the Gospel of Mark, is that final week of the life of Isa alayhi salam. So the cross, or the death of Isa alayhi salam, this is the seminal moment of all of history according to Mark. And again, this is influence from Paul. So Paul's Gospel, in Paul's interpretation of what happened to Isa alayhi salam, the cross is very central. he says, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15:17, if Christ is not raised, our faith is in vain. In other words, if Jesus was not killed and resurrected, then there's no point to Christianity. Christianity hinges on this whole idea, this whole concept of a dead Messiah, right? Which Paul recognizes is a contradiction for Jews, because the Jews did not believe that the Messiah was going to be killed, and they still maintain that. And of course, Islam has a very interesting answer to reconcile this problem within Judeo-Christianity. And then we have another theme, which is the parousia, the second coming. So the really, 5 main themes of the Gospel of Mark. You have eschatology, right, in belief in the end of time, which is going to be imminent. You have this sort of anti-Jewishness, the slighting of Jesus' family and his disciples. You have the Messianic secret. It's very secretive. Number 4, you have the cross, which is central. And then you have the second coming, right, that Jesus is promising that he'll come again in the lifetime of the disciples. Of course, this did not happen, and we don't ascribe this false prophecy to the actual Isa alayhi salam. This is what the Markan Jesus is saying. And again, the Markan Jesus is influenced by Pauline elements, because the Markan Jesus community was founded by Paul and his adherents, and Paul was verifiably wrong about the second coming of Isa alayhi salam. And also something interesting here about the Gospel of Mark is that it's Christologically anemic. And what do I mean by that? So the concept of Christ in the Gospel of Mark, right, is basically that Jesus is a suffering prophet and that he's a hidden Messiah, right? Jesus is only called God, Son of God, in the New Testament 2 times, right? And that's, basically nothing compared to like the Gospel of John, which we'll get to, and you'll see how much this Christology has evolved. The first time he's called the Son of God is in the very first verse of the Gospel of Mark, right? So if we turn to the Gospel of Mark, and I have the United Bible Society's Greek edition here. So we'll look at the original languages. It's important to look at the actual Greek when we read. So Mark 1:1, right? Chapter 1, verse 1 of Kata Markon. That's what it's called in Greek. It says, Arche tu Evangeliu Iesu Christu, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Huiou Theou, the Son of God. And if you look at the English translation, that's what it says exactly. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But in the Greek, the phrase Son of God is in brackets. It's in brackets. And the reason why it's in brackets is because the scholars or the editors of this critical Greek edition, the United Bible Society, is telling us that this phrase was not in the original Gospel of Mark. It was added later, right? That's what they're telling us. Why do they retain it in brackets? Is because Christians traditionally, they like to hear that Jesus is the Son of God. So they'll retain it in the text, but they let the scholars know who read the text that the brackets mean that the scholars don't believe Mark actually wrote that. So the actual first verse of the Gospel of Mark is the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, period. It doesn't say anything about the Son of God. Dr. Broots Metzger, who's used to be the head of the United Bible Society, he says this was a scribal expansion, right? A scribal expansion means that it's a forgery. Somebody later on, a scribe, proto-Orthodox scribe, later on went back into a manuscript of the Gospel of Mark and added Son of God. Why? Because again, the Gospel of Mark is Christologically anemic. It's very weak in its Christology, right? It's very weak. So in order to bulk it up a little bit, right, this phrase Son of God was entered into the text. If you read again the Gospel of John, it's very high Christology. Jesus is called the Son of God in many places. Jesus is called God in the prologue of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? So there's very high Christology, but Mark is a very frail, anemic Christology. So the proto-Orthodox bishops and fathers and scholars, they didn't like that about the Gospel of Mark. So in order to bulk it up a little bit, make it more orthodox, right, they went back into the Gospel of Mark and they put in these two words, Huyu Theu, the Son of God, to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. Last class we talked about the Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest Greek version of the New Testament on earth, right, which was found at St. Catherine's Monastery, 320 it was written in 375 of the Common Era. It was found by a German scholar named Tischendorf in the 19th century. And if you read Mark 1:1, indeed, it does not say Son of God. It says Arche tu Evangeliu Iesu Christu, without the phrase Son of God. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. So the oldest and best manuscripts of the New Testament, of the Gospel of Mark, do not contain the phrase Son of God. Okay? So we've established now that there has been scribal fabrications made to the New Testament. This is just one example. We'll come across many other examples as well, especially when we talk about the end of the Gospel of Mark. There are actually 4 endings to the Gospel of Mark. So again, the Gospel of Mark is, Christologically anemic. If you look at the actual crucifixion of Isa alayhi salam according to the Gospel of Mark, it's very, very kind of different than what we have in Matthew, Luke, and John. The crucifixion of Isa alayhi salam according to the Gospel of Mark is kind of pathetic. He's interviewed at his trial. They ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "It is as you say," and then he doesn't say another word until the very end when he's on the cross, and he cries out this, what's known as the cry of dereliction, when he says, "Ilahi, Ilahi, lama sabachthani," my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And of course, Imam Ghazali, in his Raddul Jamil, who basically takes the text and says the text is fine, the tahrif, the corruption of the New Testament comes in the ma'na. And he says here that this cannot be Isa alayhi salam. Isa alayhi salam would never say such a statement, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Right? So we compare now, when we get to Matthew, Luke, and John, we look at the passion narratives of all 4 Gospels, we'll notice that they're very different. They might initially seem basically the same because we're used to reading the Gospels what's known as horizontally. In other words, we start with Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. But the real way to read the Gospels, according to Bart Ehrman, is to read them vertically. In other words, read the passion narrative of Mark, and then immediately read the passion narrative in Matthew, and then in Luke, and in John, and then you can compare, right, how different they really are, because they are different, and there are marked differences between them that are very significant. So, next time, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to talk more about the Gospel of Mark. We're going to talk about Mark's source. Where is Mark getting his information from? Right? So this is very, very important. And we're going to talk about what's known as the synoptic problem, because we're going to move from the Gospel of Mark towards the Gospel of Matthew. And why is Matthew different than Mark? Why is Luke different than Mark? How did they use Mark, if they used Mark at all? So that's next time, inshallah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.